Sharing a stage with Tom Stoppard can be dangerous. In Hermione Lee's biography of him, she recounts the anecdote of an insecure interviewer who, due to being nervous, took a bit long to think up his next question. Tom Stoppard looked at the interviewer in front of an audience of 800 people and asked with friendly concern, "Do I see panic in your eyes?" As a reader of Hermione's masterful book, I'm of course aware of this cautionary tale of what can happen to you if you think too slowly, if you bore this unique mind. I'm also aware of this cautionary tale because that interviewer was me. I remember it very well. It was indeed panic he saw in my eyes. 2009 at the Salzburg Festival, which is where we met and became friends. Many years later, in a cafe in Notting Hill, Tom told me he was working on a Viennese play. He then sent me questions about Viennese customs, about life between and during the two wars, and about the Nazi era in Austria. I quote Tom, "I have a Nazi bureaucrat civilian in a high-up position to do with housing and requisitioning Jewish homes. It is necessary for his Jewish victims to address him by his job title, which I guess in German would be one long word. He wouldn't be the big boss of the department. It doesn't have to be authentic. You can make up a suitable title." To which I answered, "The Nazis loved the word Leiter, and they loved euphemisms, so they wouldn't have said Arisierung, they would have said Umzug, relocation. Also, they loved Amt and Hauptamt, so an invented but quite believable German job title would be Umzugshauptamtsleiter. And if he's not supposed to be the boss, he could be one of the deputies, which would be stellvertretender Umzugshauptamtsleiter." Which sounds like a joke for non-German speakers, but in German it is realistic. To which he answered, "To tell you the truth, I don't know whether to use titles in German or English, even Herr and Frau. I have German speakers whom we hear in English, of course, and also an Englishman supposedly speaking German with an accent. It's all madness with any bedrock logic. I'm putting that problem aside for the moment, but I can't resist Umzugshauptamtsleiter." But he could. In the play, the truly frightening character in question is called the civilian. When Tom sent me Leopoldstadt, still called a family album back then, I was overwhelmed. Actually, I was in tears, as have since been many people who saw it on stage. I think it is close to impossible to sit through its devastating last act without crying. I immediately volunteered as a translator into German, and while I was working on making these Viennese people speak actual Viennese, I was in constant awe of how the British playwright Tom Stoppard had managed to write the play that generations of Austrian and German writers, including of course me, should have written, but didn't manage to write. To be able to come up with something unexpected, that is talent. To come up with something that everyone who sees it recognizes as something that was missing and absolutely necessary, that is genius. My father, born in 1927, yes indeed, 27, into a Jewish family in Vienna, very much like the Merz family in Tom's play, told me about messy Christmas celebrations like the one you see in the first act. He told me about Jewish and Gentile relatives mixed together into a group in which everyone thought the question of racial belonging was rapidly becoming a relic from the past. He told me about his parents, my grandparents, having to move out of their house because someone, some civilian, had decided to take it from them and give it to their neighbor. He told me about dozens of uncles, aunts, and cousins who came to say goodbye and then disappeared forever. He told me about my grandfather forging documents and getting fake testimonies to turn himself and his wife into so-called half-Jews, thereby saving their lives and making mine possible, like Hermann Merz does in Tom's play. But Hermann's effort stays futile in the end. Sometimes life is even more dramatic than art. I'm so grateful Tom wrote this masterpiece. To me, it feels like he wrote about my Viennese family, and I know it will feel just like that to all audience members of Central European Jewish descendants. And everyone else will be overwhelmed to see a world brought back to life that was once bright and hopeful and then disappeared into the deepest darkness. We are very lucky that Leopoldstadt is making its way to New York and that its author, the living legend, is here for its only public event in New York this fall. This time, I will do my best to hide the panic in my eyes. Please join me in welcoming Tom Stoppard. So, Tom, to start with something not quite simple, I think, why is the play called Leopoldstadt? It's not a trivial question because, yes, Leopoldstadt is the old Jewish district in Vienna, but the play is not taking place in Leopoldstadt.
No, it's where they come from, where they go back to. But that's to answer your question on a respectable level. There's also this mysterious thing of the thing is this a good title or is it not? You mentioned, and I'd forgotten this, that when I sent you the play, it was called A Family Album, which still seems to me quite a good title for the story I'm telling. And at the same time, it seems to me not actually a particularly interesting title. And so the two or three of us, we discussed the possibility of calling it this or that. I think there was 5 minutes when the play was called Cat's Cradle for reasons which might emerge. But actually, and this is particularly true of Patrick Marber, who directed the play, once the idea of Leopoldstadt was thrown up, I think I suggested it. I think we all sort of felt that it actually did strike a note which was somehow sympathetic with the plays, with the subject, as well as having a slightly mysterious, enigmatic resonance in English to an English audience. So I was a bit afraid of having to constantly explain how to pronounce Stadt, but in the end it didn't matter. Now I just think of it like a play.
But that family album is something they talk about in the first act. And for me, this is actually the strongest image, and there are several very strong images that stay with the audience, but this is for me the strongest one in the play, is that image of the family album with the unknown people in it. And there's this great line, it's like a second death to lose your name in the family album. And I have these albums, black and white pictures of people who perished, and the people who knew them also perished. So I will never know how they are related to me, and I'm sure many people here have those albums. And for me, these people waving goodbye from a train, unknown by everyone, seem to me somehow the central image of the play. It's all about forgetting what happened in a family. Do you agree?
I do. And
I also think, actually, this is, of course, better on a poster than black and white people you
yes.
don't recognize. But in a way, the black and white people are
yeah.
stronger.
I think it's as it were, in a competitive spirit with Copenhagen by Michael Frayn. Listen, about the photograph thing. Actually, back in the day when one was speaking to a few hundred people, maybe many fewer, and that's as far as anything you said went, I used to be quite indiscreet. And now the shadow of the internet hangs over everything one says. So unfortunately for you, I become a bit cautious about what I actually tell you. And this is slightly borderline. The bit which Daniel referred to, which is, I'm glad to note, something of importance to him in the play, was written at a very late stage. In fact, the play was written before, as it were, I gave Granny, it's actually the two women who are in the family, before I gave them this photograph album scene. It's not even a scene, it's a kind of interpolation. It's like one page, if that. And when I watch the play, which it is my duty to do currently, I'm reminded of how much I owe to the suggestion that the grandmother in particular should have another go, should have another opportunity to be more than background. So I wrote this little scene at the suggestion of two people, actually. And watching it now, I'm so grateful to them. I've never quite acknowledged it because it's just part of the work, which is continuous and ongoing. But yeah, this is the bit which I wouldn't normally tell you, which is that there was a sort of little kind of meta reason, which is that it made that part more attractive to an actor. It was, first of all, more is good if you're an actor. I've made this mistake for many years. I always think an actor is really grateful to me if they have a chance to just sit in the dressing room for a while other people do. But it's not true. They bounce up if you give them an extra line, even if it means a different wig. So, yeah, it made it a better part for these two women in the family. And I love the fact that theatre is such an empirical art form. Well, I won't tell you what it was, because I must kind of have some limits as to how much I confide in you. But this morning I woke up to a text from the director saying, "Do you mind if I cut X, Y, Z?" And I thought, oh my goodness, is that possibly? I thought, yeah, maybe that's a good idea, and maybe we'll do it. I don't know at the moment. But my point is that theatre, for me, is this organism. Ever since I was first a public writer, in the sense of having to explain myself in public as a playwright, I've always insisted that theatre is an event, not a text. So that I feel the text is never, as it were, stabilizing. Other writers would completely disagree with that. The text stays the way it is. I just get back into the text every time I'm involved in a rehearsal. In a sense, this is my third Leopoldstadt in English, because we were interrupted by COVID in London, and there was a Leopoldstadt 2, which we tried without an intermission, which we all thought was better. And this is Leopoldstadt 3, and, a person on a galloping horse wouldn't notice any difference probably, but there are differences which are significant to me.
But I'm still not going to let you go on that topic just yet of forgetting, because at the end, in the very, very powerful last act, there is especially one remaining survivor of that family, and all the memories come back to him. And before that, he has forgotten all about that. And you have described several times that the process that led you to write Leopoldstadt was somehow similar to that. You were not aware of some parts of your own family history and past. And could you maybe talk about that?
It was different. In my case, it wasn't that my memory was jogged and suddenly I remembered things I'd forgotten. As Daniel says or implies, the play ends up with a scene in which there is a young Englishman in 1955 who would be roughly my age in 1955. And like me, he comes to England at the age of 8. And in the last scene of the play, he says a few things which represent my own feelings at that time, and indeed in arrears now. But it was not that some circumstance caused me to remember my forgotten past. It was much more the case that I didn't really know much about my past because my mother never really went there, as the phrase goes now. And I, for reasons which I can't really explain, had no special interest in insisting on looking there and going there. Why that should be so, why I didn't want to do it, is simply a question on top of a question. And that resolves into some kind of character defect, I suppose. This sort of lack, this almost culpable lack of curiosity almost. I wasn't that curious about it. I'm not sure how mysterious these utterances are. To some of them they're familiar, to other people who don't know what I'm talking about. I came to England at the age of 8, but I'd been in India 4 years, so unlike the character in the play, I could speak English, and in fact English was my only language. And my father was killed in the war in the Far East. My mother married a British Army officer, Stoppard, whose name I was given. My brother and I became little English schoolboys and never looked back, which is a harmless phrase, but in my case, I just did not look back. And I don't know what to say about it, really. My mother was nervous of the fact that we had family in communist Czechoslovakia. The Cold War was icy cold at different periods, and it could actually do you harm if you were a Czech at that time living at home with relatives in the West. It wasn't good. So yes, getting back to where we were, sorry about the circularity of all this, but I didn't have a lapse of memory. I had a lapse of character.
But, I mean, thinking about all that in your work, Arcadia came to my mind. And in the center of that play, there is a forgotten family tragedy. And at the end, nobody knows what happened except the audience. Then in Indian Ink, even the audience is unable to get the full picture of what happened with Flora back then, because it's kind of forgotten. You can't find out about the past. You have always written about the fact how everything gets forgotten by later generation, then I had to think about Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, who show up in this story. It's not their story, and they don't know where they come from. So it seems like, am I making too much of it? Or
no, I'm so grateful for this. I appear to be, I'm all of a piece, it seems.
I don't know.
I have no idea. But yes.
Oh yeah, I could also say, even the hard problem ends with a girl who does not know who's his real mother.
Yes, that is true. I think this merely underlines the well-known trope that there are only 7 plots, and you just just do what you can. Yeah.
But it did seem because
there's no panic in your eyes.
There is some panic, but there is the Nathan at the end of Leopoldstadt. He says to Leo, "You live as if you don't throw a shadow," and you have always written about people who live as if they don't throw a shadow. So somehow that has been on your mind, I would think.
Of course, there are a number of things one could say about my work or anybody else's work which are undubitably true statements. I mean, there's nothing false in them. It's just that most often, what is not quite taken into account is that there isn't really an element of self-awareness about them. So nobody, as I'm sure you can imagine this, nobody is sitting in my chair saying to himself, I ought to sort of do something about the fact that these people have a kind of fake, an unknown background which we never get to the bottom of, like an infinity of mirrors. I'm not thinking, I don't know what I am thinking. It's really difficult to talk. I mean, it's lovely to, as it were, meet you all, but I feel that I'm in a sort of slightly false position because there is some kind of natural assumption that one is aware of what one is up to and is overseeing it. And I don't really feel like that. I'd love to quote something, if I may. I can quote this, I think, without conceit, because I'm not actually sure whether it was I who wrote it, but it's something Belinsky says in The Coasts of Utopia. He's a critic, and this is Russia in the 19th century. And he explains that he's not himself an artist. He said, I'm not a poet, he said. With a real poet, you can watch him sitting there with the pen in his hand, and it's moving, and then it stops moving, and then it starts moving again. He said, what happened in that moment, he says. Not even the poet knows what happened in that moment. It's a very odd thing, the creative imagination, because it's straw without bricks and bricks without straw, and suddenly you have a brick. I don't know. All I'm saying is a kind of advanced self-defense is that I don't really work from a set of principles, and I don't really work from very much awareness of where things are going. What is that phrase of, well, you mustn't give away the plot of a play, whatever it is, warning, some kind of warning.
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler, thank you.
Don't spoil it.
Yeah. As you have already noted, my brain is going rapidly. But, in Leopoldstadt, at a certain point, a certain person suddenly is seen to be having an affair with another person. And I had no idea this was going to happen until I reached the end of the previous scene. And it sounds incredibly, I don't know, cold-blooded somehow, or even it sounds too, as it were, mechanistic. But you're more or less sitting there thinking, what can I do now which the audience won't expect? Oh yeah, I can do that. So that's what you do. It's not like before you started writing the play, you have some sense of what it must embody in what order and so on. And I'm constantly sort of denying my own mantra, which is that, you know, for me, the art of playwriting is the art of controlling the flow of information from the stage to the audience. It's all about what information is emerging and in what order and with what degree of clarity and with what degree of opacity. And I believe that's the case, but that sounds like a very self-conscious procedure, and it's quite extraordinary how much of the procedure is actually unconscious.
So is it also unconscious? You mentioned that affair in the beginning of the play, in the first act, or is it in the second already? But that affair anyway. It's a lot like a Schnitzler play. And they are actually reading and performing Schnitzler. And it did remind me a little bit, in formal terms, of The Coast of Utopia, which starts like a Chekhov play, and then both plays move ahead to become something more dark and contemporary, and maybe some people would say more Stoppardian, as they move ahead. Is that also something that you do unconsciously, or is that something that you do consciously? You model the beginning on some playwright you admire, and then you move away from them?
Well, yes, I went to see a production of A Month in the Country, Turgenev, and I loved it so much, and I sat there, I thought, I really would like to write a play for this set. Just leave everything there it is on stage, just leave everything there it is, and I'll write a play for that set. And I, in a sense, did. Part of Coast of Utopia, the second part, I think, starts like that. I'm so utterly enthralled to the kind of theatre that Chekhov invented, and I think he did invent something that I'd like to be able to do that, but actually the nature of my own imagination precludes the possibility of my writing a properly Chekhovian play. I mean, first of all, I'm very literal-minded. Secondly, I'm sort of a hostage to a kind of dramatic surprise effect, so to regularly surprise the audience and myself and so on. But I just love the texture and fabric of a Chekhovian play. But I've never, other than that, I've never never worried about trying to write the plays which I happen to admire.
So Schnitzler was not an influence on the first and second act?
Schnitzler?
Schnitzler, yes.
Well, I Englished.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
What was it called in German? We called it Dalliance. Liebelei, wasn't it?
Liebelei, yes.
Yeah, that was a Schnitzler play. I actually more or less named there's a couple of moments in Leopoldstadt which simply borrows names from Liebelei by Schnitzler. No, I don't think I've ever... I'm doing this again. I'm talking as though actually I have one I prepared earlier kind of answer. And I don't actually have that kind of answer to any question because my view of the plays is retrospective. And I wish to God I knew how I got into a new play, because I'd be doing that now. I tried before leaving England, 3 weeks ago. I was still trying. And I'm just sitting there thinking, how did I do it before? I don't understand why I can't just do it now. Yeah, your turn.
Well, let's talk about history for a bit. So another very powerful image in the play is that Christmas tree with the Star of David on its top, which might seem baffling to many contemporary audience members, but it captures exactly the spirit in a Jewish household in Vienna or Prague at the turn of the last century. Could you speak about that mixture of traditions that defined this very particular historical moment around the year 1900 in the life of Jews in Vienna and in the Austrian monarchy?
Well, my mother occasionally we would talk about the past and Zlín in Moravia, where I was born. And, when I was kind of middle-aged and she was in her last years, she wrote down some stuff for me and we talked. And she said, the thing is, all my 4 grandparents were Jewish. We were Jews. But my mother said, of course, we weren't Jews. There were Jews downtown who in black hats and locks, black garb. They were the Jews. And in the family, nobody took the slightest notice. Some of us married Catholics without comment. And so we're talking about, what are we talking about? We're talking about 1930. My mother was born in 1911. Mm-hmm. So, we're talking about a period where being Jewish wasn't actually part of her consciousness. Certainly not part of her behavior. So I'm so sorry, I actually forgot how we got here.
It was about the fact that Jewishness didn't mean that much at that historical moment to Jews. Yeah.
Indeed. Much later, I don't mean this with disrespect, but when my mother was safely dead, I was able to investigate my childhood and write about it in a long article for a magazine. That's when I understood what it was to be moved by my past. I should mention, shouldn't I, that the scar thing? Should I? I was interviewing old ladies from Zlín, from Moravia, about the years sort of 1930s. We left in 39. And one of these old ladies said, well, when I was 5, I put my hand through a glass pane and made a bad cut on my hand. And your father sewed it up. My father was a doctor in the Batia hospital in Zlín. And apparently he was the nice doctor that children chose. If they could choose who was going to sew up their cut, they chose Dr. Straussler, my father. And I thought, thank you for telling me that, how nice. And then she said, here it is. And she showed me her hand with a scar on it. And it was a very odd moment because I'd got nothing from my father. I barely could say I'd remembered him. I didn't possess anything he'd owned. Nothing, except this scar was from him. So I found a way to put that into my play, which I must add in parenthesis, was not characteristic of my career. I would, have much more tendency to avoid putting myself into plays. But yeah.
That process of assimilation, which is such an important, topic, especially of the first half of your play, I'm always confronted by bafflement when I tell American or Israeli friends that my grandparents, both born in the 19th century, that they got baptized as adults. And Americans then usually ask me whether they had some kind of religious experience or conversion, but of course that had nothing to do with it. It was the process of assimilation, and it's kind of amazing that without anti-Semites, Jews would probably have disappeared from Central Europe by assimilating. And of course we can read in Proust in how the Dreyfus affair stopped that, and suddenly anti-Semitism became so strong. And I think that's also a very important part of your play. These people, being Jewish doesn't mean anything to them anymore, to most of them, but then suddenly they're forced to realize it means a lot.
To many that's true, but as somebody in Leopoldstadt remarks, assimilation doesn't mean that you stop being a Jew. Mm-hmm. And as you just said yourself, if that were the case, Judaism would become, as it were, obsolescent. But this person says, but that's not actually what assimilation is supposed to mean. Assimilation means to continue being a Jew without insult. As other religions are assimilated, nobody insults you for being Episcopalian or whatever. I'm old enough to kind of know better and worse by now, but I don't feel at ease with myself regarding Jewishness because it doesn't really enter my mode of life. I don't feel that it affects the way I write. It doesn't affect the way I love. It's just, as it were, an interesting fact about me. And that doesn't seem quite adequate when I examine it objectively. It doesn't seem like an adequate response. And the other thing about the autobiographical element in the play is that, yes, indeed, I was triggered into it, I think, because I was made aware that my general attitude, which was that, my life was charmed. I'd been scooped out of the way of the Nazis and out of the way of the Japanese. We just went after Pearl Harbor. And then we were in India. My father was dead, but instead of going back to Czechoslovakia, which by 1948 had become a communist country, we were made into little English schoolboys. This great good fortune was visited upon me. So it wasn't difficult for me to become a little complacent about that. And that turned into the accusation that one is living as if without history.
But in a way, you share that predicament with the people in your play, because they're coming from Eastern Europe, and they often, in that particular moment, the turn of the century and 1 or 2 decades after that, they don't want to be confronted with their Eastern European past, and they have cut off the connections to their families or at least they're not going there, to their families in Ukraine and Poland. And so, in a way, they are also trying, back then, they tried to live without history, and then, of course, it turned out they couldn't. Actually, even in it was the First World War already that broke that narrative, because the Tsar's armies were advancing, and lots of many tens of thousands of Jews from Ukraine and Poland moved to Prague and to Vienna. And for the assimilated bourgeois Jews, it was an embarrassment. Their biggest aim was to convince everyone we are not like those people. So in a way, you shared what you just described with your characters in the play.
But yes and no, because I was so unconscious of my history that I had nothing to confess to or boast of. As far as, I don't know how or why, but I took to England. Oh, well, one hates to be original, so I'll say like a duck to water. I just took to everything I loved, and of course, just starting off with the literature, but also the landscape. When I went back to Czechoslovakia for the first time, I guess when I was about 40, and I had no sort of aesthetic response to these hills and forests. It was a foreign country, and I could add, and besides, the wench was dead, but as a heavy symbol. But I had, to me, the architecture of Georgian England, the landscape of Turner, the poetry of pretty much anybody until, what should I say, the Second World War, beyond. I felt Eliot was the poetry which chimed with me. I mean, I could go on with this. It becomes more and more silly, but yeah. So much later, and I'm ashamed to say, in translation, I could then kind of belatedly discover the people I'm reading in my 9th decade, for heaven's sake. The book I'm just finishing is by Joseph Roth, and 2 hours ago we were in the Neue Gallery bookshop, and I couldn't deal with things at that moment because I had to do the why, but there were at least 6 books I wanted to take away, and none of them were Evelyn Waugh, whom I loved, absolutely loved, and love still. But they were Stefan Zweig and so on. When we were talking about things that you had to translate on my behalf, I did think, am I too late to learn a new language now? Just my schoolboy French and my over-refined English sometimes. And I suppose the answer is yes, it is too late. It's like trying to learn the piano at this point. So it's a shame.
But then why did you actually set the play in Vienna and not in Czechoslovakia?
Old habits die hard. It wasn't going to be about me, for heaven's sake.
Yeah.
And you never know. My mother might have been listening. Also, autobiography is a kind of trap. You don't want to actually trap yourself into it. And of course, there is the fact that Vienna was one of the most interesting places on earth at that time in culture.
Yeah.
So it was a very exploitable context for any story I wanted to tell. And I'm very fond, all my life, I've been fond of just referencing things which are outside the play, but within the confine of the audience of the play. It's kind of like making, or at least not making them, but offering the audience a chance to do some of the work. There's nothing an audience likes better than that.
Mm-hmm. But it is absolutely amazing how these people live with culture and art and literature and music. And from today's perspective, to see the role all these things play in their life feels like a lost paradise. But then, of course, also someone like Tony Judd has argued that there is something, a filament of sadness at the root of that, because they came from their grandparents, often their parents were still in Eastern Europe. They came to the capitals of the empire, and they were not really welcomed. And somehow they made Goethe and Schiller and Mozart their home because they were not accepted to still anti-Semitic society. So it is very beautiful, but how much they love all these things. But then also it is a sign of them not fully belonging.
You know, suddenly you'd embraced Goethe and Schiller as well. This is so true. There's probably a German phrase for this, but there's some kind of national spirit which is the nation more than the politics is the nation. Mm-hmm. Russia, because of the great writers that we know and the ones we read, Russia it's a great nation by the criteria which mean most to me. This country, which is attacking Ukraine, in some bizarre form of coincidence, has got the same name as the country that I revere and have always, since I was a grown-up, loved, and still do. You know, one of the axes of my playwright's life is with Moscow. It's not only New York. So, you know, the Germany of Goethe and Schiller and much more modern writers, for that matter, as must be true of Britain, the writing, and perhaps this is the point and definition of art, transmits something essential about the place it comes from, the language it's in. It transcends our sort of squabbling, because when the squabbling moves to another thing to squabble about, the great art of that nation is there as before, to inspire another generation. I'm trying to encapsulate something, but I think I'm going to rely on you to help.
Yeah, well, you mentioned Russia, so would like to make a little detour. There's a lot of discussion in Europe now about refusing Russians visa for the European Union. And whenever I read about that, I have to think about your Coast of Utopia and of Herzen and Bakunin and all the others, and what would have become of them if Western countries would have refused them entry to protest the brutality of the Tsar. And I think Coast has somehow become the most relevant play of our historical moment, which is quite frightening. Were you aware of that when all this happened? Did you think this is the moment I somehow anticipated when I wrote about Coast of Utopia and the people in Russia fighting the Tsar?
I really didn't. I've never managed to outguess history. I don't think many people do. I mean, was there anything at all which was less likely to happen than the fall of communism, if one were looking at communism in 1978? You know, was there anything anywhere which was less likely to happen within 10 years? No, 3 years earlier. I wish if it's not so much, it's not really about learning a new language. It's like learning a new kind of language for writing, a new kind of play writing. The question is whether I'm too old to engage with something which is, first of all, political, and secondly, absolutely contemporary. Mm-hmm. I don't feel that I have that sensibility. I've always taken some secret pride in being an artist of some kind, because I always felt that art laid down a kind of matrix of moral sensibility. And alongside this, right from when I first left school, I've had a certain kind of tendency to honor the idea of journalism, because I felt that journalism was the medium through which one could alter a society to conform with a more moral sensibility. That the play, if you like, kind of lays down an idealized future for how we behave towards each other. And journalism keeps us aware of what's going on in the world and prevents us from being fooled too often. But I don't know how to combine the two.
But I do feel there is some real anger in Leopoldstadt, and maybe I'm wrong about that, in the last act when they talk about how the free world let the Jews down and didn't help them, and all the things that were not done to help them, and the catastrophe of Evian, and the catastrophe of the St. Louis. You kindly adapted my play about that. So I feel like that is some hot core of anger that Leopoldstadt is transmitting. You're not relaxed about that.
To me, that's rather clinical. It's fine, you know. It's in the play. She says it. It makes sense, and it's historically important. It's the easiest part of Leopoldstadt to write. I could write that in my sleep. What is really difficult is not that sort of statement. Are you being sued by somebody?
Yeah, seems like it. Yeah. No, I got the questions. I got the audience questions. We're gonna move towards soon.
Well, you know, it's a secret which I hope doesn't get back to any of the actors. But one of the things I really like most in Leopoldstadt, you know, there's a sort of speech about the failure of the Evian conference and the American quota and all that. So in Vienna in 1938, a good number of Gentiles divorced their Jewish spouse in order to escape the murder machine. And in my play, there's a Protestant in this extended family, and somebody says, are you going to divorce Wilma? And I never talked to the actor about this. I mean, I just wrote for the character to say, divorce Wilma? What an idea. And the actor has found a way to be absolutely furious by the suggestion, to treat it with utter contempt. I wish I hadn't said this now, because it's all on the bloody internet, isn't it? I was just talking to the people in the room. But yeah, what I'm trying to say is that that's a sort of detonating fragment. It's a detonating moment. Whereas a speech about the American quota system and its failure to act and all these countries on Lake Geneva, you try to make it as gainly as possible. Gainly is the opposite of ungainly, I guess, and that's it. But we have questions from the audience, like, where
no, but I see what you mean. One is a genuinely theatrical moment, and the other one is a moment where actually it's the facts that make people angry, but not the...
Yes, and it was what we were talking about. It's the difference between politics and humanity.
But people do groan when Rosa gives that speech.
Yes,
so
do they? Really?
Yeah, they do.
Okay.
Yeah. So one question, what role do you play in casting? Does seeing who is playing a part among other parts affect revision, or even what and for whom you have written subsequent plays?
I'm quite involved in casting the first time round. It's an arduous process. As I get older, I get lazier about that sort of thing. And actually, in this particular case, the director was in New York on his own for a couple of weeks, casting most of the 30-odd parts. And occasionally, in the past, I've written roles with actors in mind. Particularly, there was a wonderful actor. Anybody who's sort of my age might remember John Wood in... So that's happened also. But at the same time, one hopes that the play will be done by somebody else later, and so it's not that limiting. The only thing I'd say about the rest of that little question is that it's interesting how being a playwright is a very solitary occupation, isolated occupation, until you're ready to turn it into theatre, and then it's not solitary at all. You become interdependent with a large group of people for a long time.
So next question here is, are there differences in British and American audiences? Yes.
Right.
And how has this influenced your preparation of the Broadway production?
I don't think there is any difference of any significance. I certainly, obviously it's an Anglophone play, and these are Anglophone countries united more than divided by their language. Certainly, I don't think I can say that there's a sort of New York version of a line. Mm-hmm. No, it comes from the character. I rely on their people. I write for myself, people like me, and I rely on these people living in both countries, which they do. And what was the other thing there?
That was it.
That was it, yeah.
So I like that question. Would you both talk about your collaboration on the play about the tragedy of the voyage of the St. Louis?
Oh, yes.
I didn't smuggle that in there. It's really here.
Did you write that one? Yeah. So it's really interesting. There's a book by a couple of English writers about the voyage of the St. Louis. Louis or Louis?
I think Louis.
Okay. This is a boat which left Germany in 1939, full of escaping refugee Jewish families who were hoping to start a new life in Cuba. And they left Hamburg, I think it was, with some expectation of being allowed to settle in Cuba. At the Cuban end, there was so much slightly comical corruption and also uncomical corruption, and also politics of various kinds. And in the end, they were not allowed to land, and the boat headed back to Hamburg. And indeed, they were all they kind of knew that they were going to their deaths. And there was a book about this voyage, and Daniel adapted the book for the German theater. And I read his play in his translation because he was interested to see whether it might be done in English. And when I read the play, it just seemed to me that it would instantly work as a radio play. And so I adapted it, which required very little effort on my part, as a radio play, which went out on the BBC probably a year and a half ago, I don't know. And fascinatingly, I'd never heard of the St. Louis until then, and subsequent to that, I kept hearing about it, the way things are.
Yeah, if I can add something to that, giving this play to Tom and having it adapted by him was the most amazing experience. It was like being rewritten by Chekhov. It became so much better. So it was one of the most amazing and humbling and thrilling experiences of my writing life. Didn't see that one coming. What are you going to write next?
I have no story, and theatre is a storytelling art form, and therefore I don't know the answer to the question.
Okay, one more, and then I have a last one. This one, in the play, the game Cat's Cradle is important to the plot and possibly the meaning of the play. How did this game become part of the play?
Right, that's an interesting question, because I can't really remember how it became part of the play. It was something I think I'd saved up before there was any such play. I mean, although I have absolutely no skill for mathematics and very little knowledge of mathematics, I love mathematical history, and I like mathematical principles. And you can be very, as it were, complicit with all of that without having any arithmetic. So the idea that in the Cat's Cradle, every state emerges from a previous one, that they're actually deeply connected with each other. One turns into the other, which then turns into another, and they look different from each other, but you realize that below the surface, something structural is connecting each stage, each manifestation, each form. And it's not advisable to over-examine these stray thoughts and turn them into powerful metaphors. They won't stand up to that kind of treatment. But they are nevertheless the little spurts of fuel which goes into the carburetor. What a poetic simile. You know, they're the kind of thing which gives you something to write about above and beyond what the thing thinks it's being written about. Yep.
In that vein, does Ludwig indeed solve the Riemann hypothesis?
Sorry, say what?
Has Ludwig indeed, has he solved the Riemann
Oh,
hypothesis?
the Riemann hypothesis.
Has he solved Riemann?
No, nobody has to this day.
So because of course his solution is lost, but in your mind, has he
In my mind,
solved it when he thinks he solved it?
well,
Shortly before he dies?
the actual words are that he thinks
Yeah.
he's found a new way into it. And I do believe that, yes. But by that time, nobody had a pencil.
Yes. Thank you very, very much.